Introduction. Charles Sanders Peirce, 1839–1914, was born and raised in the most intellectually advantageous circumstances offered by 19th-century America. Benjamin Peirce, his father, was professor of mathematics and astronomy at Harvard and a preeminent American scientist who served many years with the United States Coast and Geodetic Survey. The talented parent recognized his son's great gifts and devoted many hours to training Charles's mental facility and powers of concentration. After Charles's graduation from Harvard, Benjamin arranged for his Coast Survey employment, which lasted for 30 years. Charles probably also owed to his father an assistantship at the Harvard Observatory from 1869 to 1872, which resulted in his only book published in his lifetime, Photometric Researches, 1878. In these positions Charles not only made lasting, internationally recognized contributions to geodesy and astronomy but gained the closest practical familiarity with scientific method of any American philosopher. As with Peirce's science, so too did his philosophy owe something to his father's early assistance. Charles recalled in old age that before I came to man's estate, being greatly impressed with Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, my father pointed out to me lacunae in Kant's reasoning which I should probably not otherwise have discovered. One at least partly owing to his father's influence, Peirce's new list of categories, 1867, revised Kant's categories and, in doing so, first opened the way, as Max Fish has observed, to making the general theory of science fundamental in logic, epistemology, and metaphysics to the new list, together with the related cognition series of 1868-69 questions concerning certain faculties claimed for man, consequences of four incapacities, and grounds of validity of the laws of logic, and his 1871 review of Fraser's edition of the works of George Berkeley, was one of the most important and thorough challenges to the Cartesian tradition since it came to dominate Western philosophy in the 17th century. That a life begun so well should end in poverty and ruin is tragic, but it also lends poignancy to one of the basic thrusts of Peirce's semiotic that self-knowledge is no easy affair. By comparison with other 19th-century intellectuals, Peirce married early, at 23, to Zena Fay, the daughter of the Episcopal Bishop of Vermont. The marriage was unhappy. In 1875, when Peirce was in the middle of a scientifically successful but financially disastrous year of gravitational work in Europe, Zena sailed home alone, and they eventually divorced. Unaccompanied when he next visited Europe in 1877, Peirce occupied himself during the voyage by writing the first of his famous popular science essays on the logic of science. That essay, The Fixation of Belief, concluded that the genius of a man's logical method should be loved and reverenced as his bride, 159. The series' second essay, How to Make Our Ideas Clear, pointedly likened an obscure idea mistakenly cherished to the fabulous German Melusina, 164, Zena's given name. Divorce itself was a large stigma to bear in respectable American society, but Peirce compounded his problems with further affronts to middle-class sensibilities. At Johns Hopkins, where he was appointed part-time lecturer in logic in 1879, there was a mistaken impression that he was an agnostic. Moreover, he became embroiled in unpleasant disputes with other members of the Hopkins faculty. Although he fell short of the needed standard of diplomacy in such controversies, the surviving documents do not suggest that he alone was at fault for the bad feelings. The final blow, however, was the discovery by the university's trustees that Peirce had shared accommodations with a mysterious French woman, Juliette Pourtalais, before marrying her in 1883.3. His appointment, which he had expected to be made permanent, was terminated. 7 years later, in 1891, he reluctantly resigned from the Coast Survey after lengthy disputes with its officials. Peirce's fortune spiraled downward. Squandering his inheritance on a grand house in the small resort town of Milford, Pennsylvania, he mixed with the moneyed high society that congregated there and indulged in grandiose plans for making a fortune. Not all of his money-making schemes were unrealistic in themselves, but they were unrealizable by Peirce, with his impulsive character and damaged reputation. By writing dictionary definitions, assisting with engineering calculations, and lecturing occasionally, he was able to support himself for a time, but he ended his days living on the charity of relatives and friends such as William James. 3/4 of a century after Peirce's death, his philosophy is beginning to receive the attention it deserves. The fact that Peirce left his system incomplete seems less and less to obscure the equally important fact that few philosophers have accomplished so much so well. Although there has always been a small group of philosophers knowledgeable and appreciative of Peirce, there has recently been a rapid and remarkable surge of interest among scholars in a wide variety of disciplines. This interest extends far beyond Peirce's native United States. The sesquicentennial of his birth was commemorated in September 1989 by an international congress at Harvard with more than 400 scholars in attendance. Humanist scholars, more or less independently of Peirce, have been coming round to something like his description of language and thought as processes of sign interpretation, but they badly need his chastening realism. The last 25 years have brought many new methodologies. Among these are deconstruction and post-structuralism. Although there are important differences between them and although their adherents sometimes quite ardently oppose each other, these methodologies may be conveniently grouped under a broad rubric: the interpretive revolution. The spokespersons for these methodologies attribute an extraordinary degree of either freedom or transitoriness to human thought, language, and interpretation with little explanation of how such a universe is possible or of how reasonably honest and thoughtful people could have so wrongly overestimated the constraints within which human beings live. These methodological radicals would do well to consider Peirce's semiotic realism, according to which interpretation proceeds under the weight of many natural, logical limits. Both the 1868-69 cognition series and the better-known popular science essays of 1877-78 culminate in defenses of logic as objective and natural, making clear that the goal of Peirce's semiotic was constructive rather than deconstructive. Not the arbitrariness of meaning but the objective validity of logical truth was his cherished object. Yet contemporary methodological radicals, in rejecting simplistic empiricism as a model of humanity's relationship to the natural world, have helped to prepare an audience for Peirce. At the same time, Peirce scholars have corrected the once conventional opinion that Peirce was a failed genius, thwarted by his difficult personality and his tormented personal life. He has been most widely remembered as the man generously credited by William James with the founding of pragmatism but who otherwise accomplished little because he did not hold a permanent university appointment. After he died in poverty in 1914, it was commonly said that he had published little. Actually, during his lifetime Peirce published more than 10,000 pages in scholarly journals and popular periodicals, in scientific annuals, and in dictionaries and encyclopedias, an amount equal to 20 books of 500 pages each. 4 He contributed to mathematics and to many sciences: chemistry, geodesy, astronomy, and experimental psychology, as well as to philosophy, where his chief contributions were in logic and metaphysics. In short, Peirce was a polymath whose published writings have lain scattered in so many different places that it has been difficult to estimate them justly. Indiana University Press is correcting this situation with a 30-volume collection entitled Writings of Charles S. Peirce, begun under the leadership of Max Fish and the general editorship of Edward C. Moore. This new edition will supersede what was previously the standard published source, the 8-volume collected papers of Charles Sanders Peirce, of which the last 2 volumes, 1958, were edited by Arthur W. Burks and the first 6, 1931-35, by Charles Hartshorne and Paul Weiss. To these scholars, especially Hartshorne and Weiss, whose work was for half a century the only published source for many important papers, all Peirce students must be grateful. But the new edition of writings, which now goes forward under the direction of Christian J. W. Cloisel, will be an immense improvement in its chronological arrangement, in its comprehensiveness, and in its editorial thoroughness. As this introduction is written, the 4th volume has recently been published, and it is hoped that the entire edition will be complete shortly after the end of the century. By then it is possible that Peirce will be generally recognized as the greatest American philosopher and perhaps even, as Sir Karl Popper said, one of the greatest philosophers of all time. Meanwhile, the present selection is aimed at filling the need for a 1-volume collection to make Peirce's writings on semiotic accessible to students and to scholars in disciplines other than philosophy. While there are other Peirce collections in print, they date from a time when there was not much general interest in semiotic. This is the first single-volume collection offering a general introduction to Peirce's semiotic and aimed at showing that semiotic was at the heart of his philosophy. Much of the material printed here has appeared in no other single-volume edition, and the rest had been divided among collections with no special focus on semiotic. The semiotic aspect of even this previously anthologized material should therefore be more easily comprehended here. An additional objective of this edition is to publish accurate texts. Obvious errors in punctuation, spelling, or typography have been silently corrected, and in a few instances words have been added in brackets for clarity. Translations are also provided within brackets following foreign language passages when the context does not indicate their meaning, and I have used the translations given in the Indiana edition. With these exceptions, the following selections are faithful to the sources identified after the headnotes. Inconsistent but not obviously erroneous spelling, punctuation, and word usage have been retained in order to present the text to the reader as Peirce himself intended. Nearly all of the essays included here that were published in Peirce's lifetime are printed uncut, in the form in which he intended to present them to the reader. All footnotes are Peirce's, but full bibliographic information has been added in brackets where his citations are incomplete. All other editorial annotation has been foregone in order to allow space for as comprehensive a selection of Peirce's semiotic writings as possible in a single, compact volume. Excellent editorial notes may be found in the present and forthcoming volumes of the writings. Readers well acquainted with Peirce's writings on signs will recognize how limited in scope this edition is. But no single volume could provide an entirely comprehensive survey of Peirce's intricate analyses of the various types and divisions of signs. The object of this volume is to offer a general overview of his semiotic theory. Those inspired to seek a deeper acquaintance with Peirce should turn to the collected papers and, better yet, to the writings as those volumes become available. Peirce's semiotic, as he preferred to spell it, is best understood as a stage in the history of philosophy of mind and especially as a rejection of Western philosophy's traditional problem of knowledge as it was defined in the 17th century by René Descartes and John Locke. Descartes divided the created universe into 2 substances, matter and mind. The essence of matter was extension. The essence of mind was thought. External objects were represented subjectively in the human mind by ideas. Locke extended Descartes' system of ideas into an argument for empiricism, a description of every idea as either a copy of a sensation or a reflection upon the mind's operations. It is well known that Locke's system had skeptical implications. If our ideas are internal experience, we have no way of knowing whether our ideas completely or accurately represent their external objects. Many histories of 18th and early 19th century philosophy are therefore organized around the various materialist, idealist, common sense, and transcendentalist responses to the epistemological skepticism that Locke's system helped to provoke. These well-known facts must be contrasted with a much less well-noticed tendency in Descartes and Locke's views. They affirmed and inspired confidence in one form of knowledge, self-knowledge, or knowledge of one's own thoughts. Even if I imagine a chimera, said Descartes, it is not less true that I imagine it. 6 Whether the mind's ideas are true or false, the mind accurately and completely perceives the ideas as in themselves they really are. For let any idea be as it will, said Locke, the idea can be no other but such as the mind perceives it to be. 7 Although Locke proposed a science of signs in a famous passage of the essay concerning human understanding, he meant by signs not thoughts but words and other devices for representing thought externally and communicating it to others. As far as ourselves are concerned, there is no need for our thoughts to be represented in signs, according to Locke, for they are present and immediately known to us. This notion that human beings possess infallible knowledge of their thoughts exercised a profound influence in modern history. Confidence in self-knowledge underlay much of 18th and early 19th century Western culture. The free market ideology depended on a new confidence that human beings, tempered by the moral sense propounded by Francis Hutcheson and Adam Smith, were capable of discerning their self-interest. Conversely, if people with immediate knowledge of their mental processes feel free, they possess seemingly empirical evidence for free will. The emphasis on individual autonomy in Republican political theory, education reform, feminism, abolitionism, and humanitarian movements of all sorts rested on such arguments. To the degree that 18th and early 19th century faith in individualism, democracy, and freedom rested on confidence in the immediate availability of self-knowledge, it rested on what now seems to have been a great mistake. Much 20th century psychology rejects Locke's notion that self-knowledge is immediately available to the conscious mind. So too did much Western psychology before Locke denied that humanity was capable of immediate self-knowledge and self-control. Western intellectual history since the middle of the 19th century might well be written around the theme of the long, slow, reluctant, and far from complete disengagement from the belief that self-knowledge requires only an inward glance. But one 19th century American quickly and completely abandoned belief in introspective self-knowledge. As early as 1867, when he was 27 years old, Peirce rejected both Cartesian dualism and the Lockean description of all thought as the experience or internal perception of ideas. The difference between an idea and a sign is at the heart of Peirce's semiotic. An idea may supposedly occur, in Descartes' terminology, clearly and distinctly in the mind. 8 Because the idea is perceived introspectively in the mind, its meaning is intuited, or immediately known. A sign, as Peirce employed the term, is also a thought, but it differs from an idea in that its meaning is not self-evident. A sign receives its meaning by being interpreted by a subsequent thought or action. A stop sign at a street corner, for example, is first perceived as an octagonal shape bearing the letters STOP. It is only in relation to a subsequent thought, what Peirce called an interpreton, that the sign attains meaning. The meaning lies not in the perception but in the interpretation of the perception as a signal to stop or, better still, in the act of stopping. Peirce held that, like the perception of the stop sign, every thought is a sign without meaning until interpreted by a subsequent thought, an interpreton. Thus the meaning of every thought is established by a triadic relation, an interpretation of the thought as a sign of a determining object. Consequently, there is no such thing as a Lockean idea whose meaning is immediately, intuitively known or experienced. Of course people feel that they have immediate knowledge of many of their thoughts, but Peirce pointed out that that feeling has not prevented men from disputing very warmly as to which cognitions are intuitive. 36. Many beliefs once thought to be intuitive have turned out to be inferential in origin. Prior to Berkeley's book on vision, for example, nothing seemed more self-evident than that the third dimension of space is intuited, but Berkeley showed it to be inferred. Since the feeling that some knowledge is intuitive has often been mistaken, and since the feeling is the only evidence for intuition, there is no ground for belief in intuition. Only by external facts can thought be known at all, and thus follows the revolutionary conclusion that all thought, therefore, must necessarily be in signs. 49. Thought is not immediate perception or undeniable experience of ideas within a self. Thought is in signs that attain meaning through the triadic relation, object sign interpreton. According to Peirce, the triadic nature of thinking is exemplified in the process through which the concept of the self is, itself, created. An infant, inferring no self, knows no distinction between its body and the body of a hot stove. The child may therefore touch the stove. From the resulting feeling, sign, the child arrives at the conclusion, interpreton, that there is such a thing as error and that it inheres in itself, object. Moreover, every thought, regardless of its object, is, according to Peirce, a feeling that semiotically manifests the self. When we think, then, we ourselves, as we are at that moment, appear as a sign. 67. The relation of object and interpreton through the sign or feeling is therefore also a phenomenal manifestation of ourselves, just as a rainbow is at once a manifestation both of the sun and of the rain. 67. Like the rainbow, the self is manifested in a sign relation. Indeed, the self is the sign relation, since feeling is meaningless unless it is interpreted as the sign of an object. To describe thinking as an interpretive process seems to open the door to just the sort of epistemological doubt that Peirce's philosophy was meant to avoid, but he believed that his views were grounds less for skepticism than for faith. Peirce refused to address Kant's critical question whether thought can truthfully signify reality because he believed on faith that it can do so. But he followed Kant's method of analyzing conceptions in order to explain why truth is attainable by thinking. From Kant, Peirce had learned that every cognition contains a sensual element. 17. Truth being the agreement of a sign with its object, Peirce held that an entirely true thought cannot become true but must be true even the first time it is thought. Since derivation not in time is the relation of accident to substance. 21. And since the sign is thought, the object is thought. This constitution of the known universe in thought was Peirce's idealism, as it is sometimes called, but it is more accurately described as semiotic realism. For it is based on a common sense acceptance of the world as it is apprehended and holds that the world is thus accurately represented to us because the very thoughts or signs in which we conceive of the world share a monistic or substantial identity with it. Humanities scholars and social scientists may find Peirce's monism and semiotic realism useful as a model for relating mind to body, thought to action, and culture to society. Many of the methodological disagreements within and between disciplines are owing to the Cartesian dualism that still dominates much scholarship in the humanities and social sciences. Many of us tend to subscribe unquestioningly to two propositions that actually contradict each other. 1. External reality can be experienced in thought, even though, 2. Thought is supposed to be internal or subjective and therefore entirely distinct from external reality. By describing thought as bodily feeling or action, Peirce's semiotic realism avoids this contradiction and cuts through many of the resulting snarls that befoul contemporary discussion of the relation of thought to behavior. Thinking, in Peirce's view, is not something that must be somehow related to behavior. Thinking is behavior. Thinking is action just as real, just as historical, just as behavioral as operating a machine, fighting a war, or eating a meal. Peirce's model of thought as feeling or action corrects the assumption of some hard social scientists that thinking is not as real and potentially influential as other, seemingly more tangible, elements in human life and society. Similarly, it corrects the view of some humanists that thinking is an utterly free process, unfettered from the relations in the natural world that constrain other kinds of human activity. These unrealistic methodological biases are, at bottom, derived from either materialist or idealist rebellions against Cartesian dualism. Peirce's semiotic offers a middle ground, a rejection of dualism that nevertheless avoids the excesses of either materialism or idealism. Even though he viewed what is commonly called matter as thought, he was no traditional idealist, for thought, according to Peirce, does not occur as ideas immediately perceived in a self or soul or mind. In the 18th century, Bishop Berkeley had responded to the problem of epistemological skepticism with an idealism that interpreted material objects as perceptions or ideas in the mind of human beings and, ultimately, God. Peirce, on the other hand, described thought as a relation of signs possessing a material quality. He was therefore willing to describe human thought in physiological terms. For Peirce, then, human thought is, among other things, a brain process of view probably congenial even to many who do not otherwise agree with his metaphysics. Yet if Peirce allowed for a material quality in thought, he also believed that materialism provides no more accurate a description of intelligence than does idealism. The universe, he insisted, could not be satisfactorily described in terms of mechanical force, or what he called secondness, the process of action and reaction when one object strikes a second. Besides material force or secondness, there is another kind of real relation that Peirce called thirdness and that we call intelligence, the representation of one object to a second by a third, which is the essence of his semiotic. A thought may be a feeling in an organic body or brain, but a feeling in and of itself is meaningless. A feeling is a mere sign, awaiting interpretation in its relation with a subsequent thought or feeling before it can have meaning. Peirce was quite willing to agree with materialists that intelligence is not immediate knowledge of ideas inside a mind or soul. But he did not agree with materialists that intelligence could therefore be reduced to mechanical force or dyadic relations between material objects. Since intelligence involves meaning or interpretation, it cannot be described in terms of mere secondness, mere mechanics, or brute force. Intelligence is a triadic, representational relation in which one object is represented to a second by a third, a sign. All three categories are objectively real. Firstness is the sheer thisness, or existence, of things. Secondness is dyadic, or reactive, relations between things. And thirdness is triadic, or representational, relations among things. Since thirdness, or intelligence, is objectively real, thought cannot be discounted as a general force in the universe, as Peirce believed most modern scientists had done. This is yet another realist dimension of semiotic realism. The sign relation is real, and therefore scholastic realists were right about universals. Deploring the nominalist tendency of modern science to affirm the reality of only individual facts and dyadic relations between them, Peirce held that general principles are really operative in nature. 244. Denial of the real force of thirdness, or thought, in the world was attributable either to madness or blind loyalty to materialist theory, the weakness to which Peirce attributed the implicit nominalism of his scientific colleagues. Seen against the background of Peirce's view of thought as objectively real and not bodilessly confined within a subjective self, the recent interest by literary theorists in self-fashioning and in decentering the self appears less radical than it is usually supposed to be. These theorists see the self as a cultural construct or artifact but offer no explanation of how it is constructed beyond assertions of a constitutive power in language. Perhaps they mean to suggest a semiotic realism similar to Peirce's. But they are unclear, and it is more likely that they have not thought the matter through and mean only that it is subjective identity that is fashioned by and in some transcendental self. As Vincent Colapietro has said, surely textualism is simply the most recent variety of the idealistic ideology. 9. Although some passages in Peirce suggest a similar failure to escape subjectivity, he went far beyond any concept of the self as ideal or subjective. Sometimes he reads like a harbinger of the most recent motif of literary theory: men and words reciprocally educate each other. 84. But words, for Peirce, were thoughts, and he carried his description of thinking as a process of objective, interpretive relation to its logical conclusion. If the self did not contain thought, thought contained the self. As a young man he philosophized that just as we say that a body is in motion, and not that motion is in a body, we ought to say that we are in thought, and not that thoughts are in us. 71. This was an opinion he never abandoned, despite changes in his metaphysics, and in old age he advised William James that one must not take a nominalistic view of thought as if it were something that a man had in his consciousness. It is we that are in it, rather than it in any of us. 10. Why is Peirce's assertion of the constitutive power of thought better than a similar claim for language by some literary theorists? The answer is that the literary theorists derive their semiotic from French linguistics, especially Ferdinand de Saussure's emphasis on the supposedly arbitrary relations between the signify, interpreton, in Peirce's terminology, and signifiant, sign. While words may be arbitrary in some respects, verbal language is far too narrow a field from which to construct a general theory of signs, as becomes evident from the arbitrariness posited of the social world by those who suppose that it is constituted in language. Peirce's theory, based on an analysis of thought rather than language, in the narrow, verbal sense, posits within the signifying process not only an object and its sign but also a third element, the interpreton, or thought, to which the sign gives rise. The meaning of the sign is not necessarily arbitrary but may be as logical as the thought that interprets it. While some contemporary literary theorists tell us that signs are arbitrary, verbal representations of their objects and as free to depart from them as rose from its flower, Peirce pointed out that many interpret and predicate real relations between signs and their objects. He called such signs indices, and one of his favorite examples was the interpretation of a weathercock as accurately signifying the direction of the wind because of its having a real relation with the wind. Moreover, even arbitrary symbols such as the stop sign are nevertheless not arbitrarily interpreted. A stop sign might just as well be triangular in shape if that were the arbitrarily chosen convention, but its interpreton would still be the thought of stopping. A driver might of course arbitrarily interpret the stop sign to mean floor it. In doing so, however, he would put himself at real risk. Peirce's semiotic therefore allows for realistic recognition that human life and society are to a significant degree a matter not only of freedom but also of constraint, a matter of people being shoved this way or that by bullets and ballots, a surplus or shortage of land, the rise and fall of technologies and industries, and so on. On the other hand, Peirce's monism and semiotic realism allow for some freedom or, rather, a role for thought. By explaining how thought is action, Peirce's semiotic makes it possible to understand why thinking, language, and culture are real historical forces. Semiotic is no magic wand that lets us avoid the hard work of thinking, but by adopting the viewpoint of Peirce's semiotic, it is possible to avoid either gnawing the old bone of the relation of thought to behavior or else isolating intellectual activity from society. Once intellectual activity is understood to be real behavior, its possible importance can be weighed fairly against other real elements in society. Conversely, social institutions such as government, political parties, corporations, labor unions, voluntary associations, and so on may be regarded as thought, once a thought is understood to be, not an idea known immediately within a mind, but rather, an interpretive relation. Once thought is understood as a process of sign interpretation, a great range of social phenomena too large to be comprehended within any individual mind may nevertheless be best understood as the result of a process of intelligence. Institutions and organizations are semiotic syntheses, so to speak, of the thoughts of a great many people. In this way, society may be understood as a human process even when study is not focused narrowly on the local and particular, as has been the fashion, for example, among social historians in the past quarter century. The superiority of Peirce's semiotic to Cartesian dualism is that it allows the study of society to be an objective science but not a strictly physical or material science. On the other hand, while thought is admitted into the real world, it is denied its traditional idealistic privileges, denied its absolute freedom, so to speak, from natural constraints. Although Peirce has great relevance for the current emphasis on scholarly synthesis and interdisciplinary methodology, his semiotic would nevertheless allow for the usefulness of much specialized scholarship in the traditional disciplines. The situation might be compared to that in the physical sciences during Peirce's own lifetime. He regretted that the increasingly materialist assumptions and biases of 19th century scientists tended to isolate the sciences, denying them integration with mental phenomena, the universe of thirdness. Yet many findings in these sciences were nonetheless useful and valid. Similarly, the adoption now of a Peircean perspective would not require the wholesale dismantling of the traditional humanistic disciplines and social sciences that seems to be called for by some other, methodologically more radical semiotics, and with nothing like Peirce's attempt to explain rather than merely to assert why our old assumptions are invalid and need to be discarded. Yet even while allowing for the usefulness of much past, traditional scholarship, Peirce's semiotic points to a new use for that scholarship by thinking about thinking in a way that does not divorce it from the natural world. Thinking in a way that does not divorce it from the natural world. Notes 1. Collected papers of Charles Sanders Peirce, 8 volumes, edited by Charles Hartshorne and Paul Weiss, volumes 1-6, and by Arthur Burks, volumes 7-8, Cambridge, Harvard University Press, 1931-58, 1:299. 2 Max Fish, Introduction to Writings of Charles S. Peirce, a chronological edition, 5 vols, to date, Bloomington, Indiana University Press, 1982, 1XXVI. 3 Nathan Hauser, Introduction to Writings of Charles S. Peirce, 4 Lee, LXV. 4 Christian J.W. Cloisel, Editing Peirce, Unpublished Essay. 5 Karl Popper, Objective Knowledge, An Evolutionary Approach, Oxford, Clarendon Press, 1972, p. 212. 6 René Descartes, Meditations on First Philosophy, in René Descartes, Philosophical Works, translated by Elizabeth S. Haldane and G.R.T. Ross, 2 volumes, Cambridge, Cambridge University Press, 1931, 1:159. 7 John Locke, An Essay Concerning Human Understanding, edited by Peter H. Niditch, Oxford, Oxford University Press, 1975, p. 364. 8 Descartes, Meditations, p. 190. 9 Vincent M. Pietro, Peirce's Approach to the Self, A Semiotic Perspective on Human Subjectivity, Albany, State University of New York Press, 1989, p. 48. 10 Peirce to James, November 25, 1902, in Peirce, Collected Papers, 8:189.